Welcome back to the Culture of Currency, where today we're going to talk about what happens during an economic collapse and what is the role of silver in things like that. And I obviously am just a YouTuber. What do I know? Well, I have the internet, and the internet has history and many things documented. And so I'm going to get into some things that I found and figure out kind of where the shades of gray are. And this is more of a conversation than it is me dictating what's going to be, because we can't do that. So I would love to know in the comments during all of this, what did I get wrong? What did I get right? And what do you kind of think is going to be the lay of the land if something goes sideways? But that's what we're going to get into. So first we have to start off with, how do our economies kind of form? We have to go through history to find that answer, because we have many population densities throughout the world that had to start with something, right? You go back, sometimes a couple of thousand years, sometimes even further than that, in order to figure out how an economy formed. So when I look at it, we start off with going from self-sufficiency, which is, an individual having to go and feed and clothe and whatever himself, to specialization. So in early societies, the hunter and gatherer, or early agricultural societies, we had people who were largely self-sufficient, producing everything they needed for survival. And there really wasn't a whole lot of exchange or trade at that point. But then we got to the rise of specialization. As society started to grow and become more complex, people began specializing in specific skills or production techniques. This could involve farming, crafting tools, or making clothing. And then specialization usually would lead to surplus, which is great, right? You can have a whole silo full of grain or whatever. And that is where you can finally get to the point where you start trading. When you have more than you need, you can trade then for other things. So if you are a farmer of, let's say, wheat, and you have a ton of extra wheat, then you might say, hey, you know what? I really want a cow. Let me trade some of this for a cow. So then we basically have, at that point, a barter system. So what is a barter system? So early on, initially people would barter goods and services directly. I go to this guy who I know makes shirts, and I will give him, the seashells that I dug up or whatever. So a farmer might trade excess grain to a weaver for cloth. Barter worked for simple exchange, but it did have limitations. Sometimes it was difficult to barter. Barter became cumbersome as societies began to diversify, and it required double coincidence of wants. Both parties needed something that the other one had of value. And if you didn't, well, why would you trade, right? If I don't need 15 shirts, then why do I want to go to this guy with my grain? So things started to become a little bit subjective. And that's where we start to get finally to the rise of some type of commodity as a currency, which creates our first real, in my mind, market. So to overcome the limitations of bartering, society started using commonly accepted commodities like salt, or this, silver and gold, and sometimes even things like seashells, right? We see that even in Native American cultures where seashells were used as mediums of exchange. So this is kind of the earliest form, I would say, of money, where we went out of a commodity where we know exactly what something would be used for, like wheat or whatever, a garment, where we go into something that is silver, that's not about you being able to eat this, but knowing that I can take this and then trade it for something else. So at the end of that, we have, in my mind, what is a formal market. Societies began to be more reliant on trade, and they designated marketplaces in their communities. You would have a bazaar or an open-air market. This is where people could gather to buy and sell goods, right? So if I knew I wanted some brand new cherries that were just picked, the guy 5 booths down on the left is where I need to go, right? You start to understand how these open-air bazaars work, and you know how to navigate them and know where to get the things you need. So people could gather, buy, and sell their goods using whatever accepted form of currency that was. When you say you're worth your weight in salt, well, that's because salt was used to preserve meat and to add flavor and do all kinds of things. And so salt was very valuable. So you could have a sack of salt and go through a marketplace and end up with a bunch of goods. So that fostered a more complex society. Once that is established, you have a proliferation of excess, let's say, then we can get to the point where we have a government forming within the economic system. And this is probably why in early cultures, why a centralized government who got there before someone else, let's say Rome or, the Persians, who around them there's just tons of land where they're not quite to the point where government is established, that they could just waltz in and take over because they had tons more infrastructure and logistics. So basically at that point, the government becomes involved, right, in regulating trade, establishing standard weights and measurements for things that we're buying, and potentially, as we know, get to the point where they issue their own coinage, which leads to the development of different economic systems like capitalism, socialism, or mixed economies. So then we have modern economies, which are complex systems involving factors like production, consumption, investment, and international trade. They are influenced by government policies, financial institutions, and technology advancements. So the government then is basically completely involved in all aspects of markets from that point on. And so we have seen economies move from self-sufficiency to specialization. And that's very important because if an economy fails, how far back does it go? Does it go all the way to self-sufficiency? Because if it does, that might also render silver and gold useless depending on how far into self-sufficiency it goes. Because if nobody wants your gold or silver, they want clothes for cold winters, if they want, firewood, if they want clean water, then this means nothing. Because once again, we need both parties to have something needed in order for a barter system to work. So that is how economies kind of form. We know that once government gets started, it kind of doesn't stop, right? All right, so now let's talk about economic collapse scenarios. If we had, let's say, the economy collapse, right? And we go into what usually happens in scenarios based on what we've seen in other countries and history and that type of thing, and to a degree, America as well. So the first thing that I notice is short-term chaos, right? It leads to a period of panic, and that is because we are human and we kind of have an involuntary knee-jerk reaction when it comes to fear, right? It clouds our mind. In fact, in martial arts and in military training, they have what's called the OODA loop, OODA, which is observe, orient, decide, and act, and that kind of keeps you on path of clarity of mind and that type of thing. When something disrupts it, you have to go back to the beginning. And so if you have fear that pops into your head, your plan of action might have to reset, and then you have to go from there. Mike Tyson says it all the time. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Well, economically, if you get punched in the face, what happens? Well, that short period of chaos ensues, and we see probably the darker days of humanity in that time where people are scared, so they're looting stores, thinking that the world is ending. Think Y2K on steroids for those of you who are around for that. Value of stocks, bonds, other traditional investments usually plummet because people get wet feet and they pull their money out of the market. So then, how far does it go back? Well, if it shifts all the way back to a barter system, then we go back to where people are trading for goods and services, which means in that society, odds are this is not doing a whole lot for you because you have to have people willing to see value in this. And as of right now, according to a study that came out, only about 10 to 11% of people have any money in gold and silver. So you finding who those people are out there that say, hey, I've got extra water, I know the value of silver or gold, and I'm willing to trade upon that alone, would be really hard, especially because you don't want to go out there and just tell people in today's society that, hey, I have silver and gold. So how do you even find those people? That'd be really hard to do. So really, this would be reserved for outside of the barter system, because in such a scenario with its intrinsic value and historical uses, currency, it could be used as a bartering tool, like we said, but you have to find people with specific needs that this meets. That's really hard to do in a barter system until you get to the point where basically things have established beyond the barter system, and currency is established again, and things like silver and gold can have an intrinsic commodity value. So in economic collapse, this $5 bill here, there's a possibility that it could be replaced, depending on government and all that kind of stuff. If the US dollar loses its ability to be a reserve currency, then things like national debt, high inflation, and loss of global confidence hits the U.S. economy. And even if we did shift into a new reserve currency, those effects would probably take some time, as we'd kind of be in the Wild West, right? Every little city or county would have to rely on the police of their area for protection and stability. It would have to rely on the truthfulness of its population. Kind of think of the Wild West, right? Marshal Dillon would have to be in every single town, kind of keeping order, which means that the people in there have to do their part too. So it would take a long time for the currencies that get established after that to take place in those areas to get them outside of a barter economy. So what would it do to silver if we went to that? Well, you'd have obviously increased volatility, because we would not know on any given day what a value of silver would be, because odds are the markets would be closed, as people would not want their shares to plummet and have all of our companies bought out via market share by international companies that are not as affected by our system. Of course, there are a lot of global factors to be in play here, and all of this is scenario, by the way, so there's no telling. I'm just throwing out things that are popping onto my brain as we're talking here. Once we get past the barter system and you have the rise of money in markets, that's really where I would see silver coming through. So if you're one of those doomsdayers that say, an economy is going to come and silver is the only thing that's going to protect your silver and gold or whatever, it depends, honestly, on how far down the chain we recede into. If we go to a barter economy, you're not carrying 20 pounds of silver or, a couple of ounces of gold around with you, most likely, because there's just not going to be places that probably accept that as currency. Unfortunately, I wish that were the case. I just don't see it, unless it does have a government face on it that we know, hey, this was, a dollar, that type of thing. So government silver, you might have a good argument to be made there. But then again, what does a 1999 quarter have that can't be given the same argument? Because 90% of the people, they just don't know about this stuff. So to me, it'd just be really hard to convince other people. And then if you do, you've outed yourself to say, hey, I've got a bunch of this. Basically, I'm using it to trade. And then do you have a target on your back? So that's something to wonder about. If you're in a barter system, then shouldn't having things like water, food, blankets, firewood, hand tools that aren't required by electricity, those types of things, do they become the most important factors? It's very interesting to know. But yeah, once we get past the barter system and we get into a rise of markets and money, that's where likely we see this. So if you have a bunch of this stuff and it's laying around and we get to the point where markets are reestablished, then there is a possibility that this becomes something that is very beneficial to hold. But then again, what we also don't know is, in that situation, what is the strength of our currency? If it's a dollar, if it's something else, what is the strength of that? And does that also weaken where silver and gold is? That's something we just don't know. So to me, it's just really hard to know in an economic collapse what silver and gold will do, mostly because we don't know how far it will collapse. And the best scenario in an economic collapse is that it's not a full collapse, and that things like the stock market and things that control the trading of commodities stay open, so that what we see is the volatility and all that within the VIX, right? The ratio of economic collapse and all that kind of stuff that's on the market rises, because usually what happens is silver and gold tend to rise at that point when markets get low. So that being said, if that were to happen, then you might be, the king on the hill. But the problem is, let's say each of these silver ounces goes to, I don't know, $400, which is a crazy number I just threw up. But let's say it does, then are you going to hold on to these knowing that it's probably not going to be that way in 20 years? Or are you going to get rid of it for cash anyway? And so that begs the question of time, because having all of this stuff is all well and good, but you are having it with the idea that one day it's going to have intrinsic value that is calculated by some type of currency like this, unless you are deciding that from this point on, I will literally be my own bank. I will only deal in my precious metals, and let's say I only need $300 this week, then I go and I sell $300 worth, then you have an argument to be made there. But that's as I see it. I know I kind of went all over the place on this one, but I just was thinking out loud because I was kind of understanding economies forming and all of this kind of stuff. Where did silver and gold kind of get their start? And why did it become so popular? And how does that play into everything? Because if we had an economic collapse, well, what does that really mean for all of this? What is likely to happen? And does that mean that we are kind of deceiving ourselves, or does that mean that we're protecting ourselves? That's something it's really hard to know. And honestly, I hope we never have to know that answer. That would be my 2 cents, is that we never get to a point where an economy fails anywhere in the world, let alone America, where any of this has to be challenged, which is what's great about being a collector, not a stacker. I don't benefit, if an economy fails. I don't look forward to it. I don't, prep for it. But I do, to a degree, just always want to be self-sufficient. That's always been my brain, I guess, ever since I was a child. And so I always want to position myself so that if something goes sideways, I can survive. So that being said, that's what I have for you today. I know I'm kind of rambling, but I appreciate you watching, and I'd love to know your thoughts. I know I probably said some crazy things today, but, I tend to say crazy things at times. And so let me know where I got it right, where I got it wrong in the comments, and we'll go from there. Thank you so much, as always, for watching. And please remember to stay classy and current with the culture of currency.